Hi, everyone. I'm Xavier. Today, I will be talking about computational principles of cultural learning and the evolutionary mechanisms that might shape it. So cumulative culture is really important. It is the engine of distinctive human achievements like skyscrapers or governmental institutions, cultural practices, moon landings. But for cumulative culture to get off the ground, as Ben illustrated, people belonging to a culture need to be able to learn and transmit knowledge effectively. The cognitive mechanism is critical, and a lot of different theorists have studied it recently. There's competing theories, and they emphasize different aspects of the cognitive mechanism underlying cultural learning. One strand emphasizes imitation in orange, copying behaviors precisely. One example is a baker's apprentice who's given an exact recipe of steps to follow. Computationally, this could be described as model-free RL. It represents action values, but not a causal model of why they're valuable. It's cheap, but inflexible when circumstances change. Another strand posits cultural transmission shares rich causal models of knowledge, values, goals, and the world. Like an apprentice that aims to replicate a supervisor's signature sourdough and knows that yeast needs warmth and sugar and that a strong rise makes a softer bread. Computationally, this is model-based RL. It's cognitively demanding, but flexible when circumstances change. For example, when sugar is out, but honey is on hand. These have been regarded as competing theories by some accounts, but by now it's clear that people use both mechanisms. There's causally opaque cultural practices like taboos in Fiji against the consumption of fish during pregnancy, as well as causally rich models that get transmitted in the world, like principles-based cookbooks. Therefore, the challenge is understanding the principles that determine when we use each of these strategies. Here, I argue that an environmental context is a critical part of the answer. Populations can coordinate on a formative representation on an optimal social learning strategy that's responsive to the demands of the environment they find themselves in. I'll discuss here some cultural evolutionary modeling I've done that builds on work by Giuliano and Nunn on a similar but distinct question. They sought to answer the question of when individuals should seek to learn from others at all versus figure stuff out for themselves. The general idea of all these models involves a kind of simplified environment with actions that lead to rewards. But the crucial point is that the actions change over time and what actions are optimal. They're subject to environmental shocks. In Giuliano and Nunn's case, different populations of agents interact. They model individual versus social agents. Their social agents correspond to a relatively model-free RL. Individual learners pay a cost to find the right action with certainty. Social learners copy an action cheaply with no cost, but they run the risk of copying the wrong action, becoming ungrounded by copying from a social learner who's got the wrong idea in their head, or by having a shock occur in the transmission chain before they act in the world. These social learners are implementing, a relatively simpler model-free strategy. And there are interesting dynamics in this interaction. I'll just quickly point out two of them. The first is that social and individual learners in Giuliano and Nunn's model find a kind of equilibrium where if there are many social learners, there's a higher chance that you got the wrong idea if you copy from a social learner. So it's better to be individual. If there are a few social learners, then it's better to be social because you can free ride off of the costs that other individual learners have incurred. Second, the precise balance between individual and social learners is itself subject to the level of underlying stochasticity or volatility in the environment. I'll also quickly note that Giuliano and Nunn's model found empirical support in some socioeconomic data sets looking at the extent of traditionalism, for example, as measured by the World Value Survey. But here, I want to extend Giuliano and Nunn's model and think about the kinds of social learning strategies that people could implement. Specifically, I want to think about how model-based social learning strategies, those that communicate rich causal models of the world, might change the dynamic. To do this, we slightly modify the environment and preserve its structure, but introduce another layer. So we have actions, we have outcomes that are observed, and reward is unobserved by default. An example of the process in the real world is like a choice between two actions that you can relatively clearly tell what they resolve in, but you don't know which is better. For example, a choice that only becomes clear over a long period of time or has very small effects like eating salmon, which might be slightly healthier than trout in some circumstances if it's caught in waters that have differing levels of mercury or something like that. This modification lets us introduce model-based social learners who learn, for example, what fish someone catches and then are able to, whatever the environment is, figure out the type of bait that will reliably catch that fish. They learn a causal model and they do goal inference. So, in order to make them not have just totally free reign, we make them pay a learning cost to fit a model of the world. And that's parameterized in our model by lambda. The key idea here is that model-based learners are immunized against environmental shock, but partially. So if they learn the right goal from somebody, then they're reliably able to attain it, but they run the risk of learning the wrong goal if they copy the wrong person. So they're subject a little bit to the volatility parameter delta, and they're subject a lot to the volatility parameter lambda, the learning cost parameter lambda. So we have these three dials that we turn, delta, kappa, and lambda. And in these simulations, what we do is vary volatility in the two learning costs and explore how different environments affect the optimal learning strategy. For each of these parameter settings, we run a Moran process where individuals in a finite population, 120 people, die and reproduce over thousands of generations. We apply selection pressure on reproduction, but not on death, and randomly shock the environment between generations. We run thousands of simulations and report the aggregate behavior of the model, first in kind of an interesting subspace of the parameters, and then I will take a step back and characterize the full parameter space. First, I'll just quickly show that this model achieves the kind of same qualitative results that we saw in Giuliano and Nunn's case, so that we can draw the connection between the two. We qualitatively replicate Giuliano and Nunn, finding that the proportions and payoffs of social learners are subject to the kind of volatility that you'd expect. So on the left, you see decreasing long-run proportion of social learners as the environmental volatility increases. And on the right, you see, or on the left, you see the long-run payoffs of social learners declining as the volatility reaches over a critical threshold. The individual learners pay a constant penalty, so they're unaffected by volatility. Cool. So that's grounding out the model in prior work, but the more interesting main results are in how the model characterizes the trade-offs between different types of social learning strategies. First, I want to talk about a moderate regime where there's a balance between model-free and model-based agents that itself depends on volatility. The panel shows many simulations conducted under moderate conditions, where it's relatively easier to be a model-based agent than it is to be an individual learner. But there's still some cost that you have to pay to be a model-based agent. You can see that as the shock probability increases along the x-axis, that the population shifts from being mostly model-based or model-free to being mostly model-based, with a relatively stable base of individual learners. So whereas before you were seeing the volatility totally wipes out the population of social learners, here that's not entirely the case. The balance between model-based and model-free social learning also depends on how hard it is to fit a model. That is how much we tune the lambda dial that's affecting the model-based social learners. So here you see the same chart that you saw before, and that's at a relatively moderate setting. Now, if I make it a lot easier to be a model-based social learning agent, you see what you expect, which is that more agents become model-based as the volatility increases. If I make it harder to be a model-based agent, then the proportion of agents in the long run who are model-free goes down as volatility increases, and they instead shift to being individual learners rather than model-based agents. So that's some results about how there's trade-offs between model-free and model-based agents in this setup. Here I want to talk about social learning in general. So whereas before in Giuliano and Nunn's case, in the orange line, you saw that when there's only one sort of model-free social learning strategy available, then as the volatility increases, the population of social learners drips down to the mutation floor. In our case, we've been able to show that when there are multiple strategies for social learning available, some of which are partially immune to environmental shock, the population of social learners can remain high even as volatility reaches extremes, because people can copy the right goal and then reliably maintain that knowledge through generations. So taking a step back, we've looked at an interesting kind of moderate regime where the costs of being a model-based agent are not trivial, but not too substantial. I want to characterize the behavior of the model as a whole across the range of the parameter space. So we have the dials, kappa and lambda, individual and model-based learning costs, and I show on the y-axis the individual learning cost and the x-axis the model-based learning cost. Here, when individual learning cost is really cheap, kind of regardless of what else goes on in the model with model-based learning cost or with environmental volatility, individual learners will flawlessly get the right answer. So there's no point in doing anything else. The population gets dominated by individual learners. In this region of the space, when high individual learning costs happen, but there are trivial model-based learning costs, model-based is kind of a next best thing to individual learning, where you nearly have a complete absorption of the population by model-based social learners. In this region of the space, where there's higher model-based learning costs than individual learning costs, we find the exact dynamics that you saw in the Giuliano and Nunn model, where you have a mix of individual and model-free social learners, and that mix is sensitive to environmental volatility. So when there's super high volatility, the population is mostly individual, super low, mostly social. And the red area of the chart is what I was describing earlier, that moderate regime subspace, where it's slightly easier to learn someone else's goals in the causal model of the world rather than figuring it out from scratch because they've communicated to you interesting information. But it's still, non-trivial, and there's a room for a population of model-free social learners who are able to reap the benefits of the investment that other people have built in maintaining a cumulative culture. Interestingly, though, that fraction of model-free social learners disappears once environmental volatility reaches the ceiling. Also, interestingly, note that under extreme learning conditions, so if you ramp up the costs for both being a social learner and being an individual learner to be very high, then social learning and individual learning can't get off the ground, and the only thing that you can do is model-free social learning. I mean, it may not be perfect because people can get the wrong action in mind, but at least you don't have to pay a linear cost to kind of fit a model of the environment or learn everything about the world. It's the kind of least bad option available to you. So what are some takeaways? In sum, we now have some predictions about how populations would work under different environmental conditions. We showed how models of cultural evolution can take seriously the different and nuanced strategies that people have available to them in the world. Second, our model revealed the role of the environment in shaping which strategies are optimal and therefore which format of information transmission people can coordinate on as a society. And third, we saw how model-based social learning can play a critical role in insulating social learners from environmental shocks, maintaining a population that's able to ratchet knowledge up culturally, but not at the same time have to figure out everything from scratch themselves. So, now we've done some modeling. The next step is to take that out into the real world with two awesome undergrad collaborators. I'm working on two distinct projects. The first is an observational study using a similar approach to Giuliano and Nunn, looking at deep time, historical climactic variability over 1,500 years, and comparing that, using that to predict individual differences in preferences over learning strategy in a global and diverse sample. And that's a correlational study. And then in experimental work, we're also looking at now building some iterated learning chains, microcultures grown in the lab, subjecting those to varying degrees of environmental volatility, and seeing the format of information transmission that emerges in messages that are passed from one generation to the next. Thank you so much for listening. Yeah.
Favorite question? First question from Nick.
Hi, Xavier. Yeah, but really nice work. I'm wondering how Rogers paradox relates to this, because it feels like the case where Rogers paradox will kick in.
Yes.
In that, as long as there are individual learners still floating around, then the payoff for everybody else must be the same as the individual learners, otherwise they'd be further eliminated. So the sort of thought of sort of cultural ratcheting and the general improvement of society through cultural evolution, I wonder how that seems slightly undercut if one thinks that the payoff for all these different types of learners is really just the same as the individual learners had in the first place. I don't just be interested in your thoughts, really.
Yeah, it's a great point. I think I have two answers. The first is that in this model in particular, it might be due to some of the setup. So if an agent is only able to observe one other agent and it's a well-mixed population, then you're right that you might end up with a Rogers paradox type situation. Second, I think it would be interesting to look at what would happen if we took the individual learners out of the model entirely and look just at a population of model-based and model-free social learners to see that, if someone gets it right to begin with, then, or, scaffolding individual learners for a short period of time, but then dropping them out entirely after burn-in of the population, what would then happen? So I think that would be an interesting way to answer that question.
Roger, at the back? Yeah, so thank you.
The details of the model setup went by rather quickly, but if I got it correctly, in a sense there's sort of a hierarchy of like if you set the costs aside, there's a hierarchy of optimality of the learning strategies. That individual learning is better because you're learning best because you're directly learning from the environment. Model based is less great than that, but still very good, but still good because you have flexibility with respect to environmental change. And then model free is in a sense the least optimal. And it's the cost that sort of bring the mixture of agents, actually like bring mixture of agent populations and agent strategies into play. And I'm wondering, is that, first of all, was that correct? And the second question is, if it's correct, do you think that that is a fully faithful reflection of actual social dynamics of cultural transmission more broadly? I'm thinking of sort of the goals are very individualistic in terms of, I think they seem to be reflecting interaction with the environment rather than interaction with other agents. At least seems to be the most natural construal. And I'm wondering if you think there are limits to that sort of characterization of the broadly based the benefits of the different strategies.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Thank you. So yeah, that's correct on the modeling setup. The flexibility of model-based or individual forms of social learning or individual learning are offset by the cognitive cost of doing those things. And you're right that, if we step outside of a relatively simplified setup where you have, one action or a series of actions in one context over the course of your lifetime where everybody has the same, reward gradient, then, real life is a lot more complicated than that model in that way. I think it would also be interesting to look at some of the ways in which model-based social learning might end up giving people a goal that isn't suitable for their preferences, for example. So I think to your point, an extension of this could be, having different populations of agents that have different susceptibility to reward for each of the two outcomes or something like that. That would be a way of extending it to partly answer that concern. But I agree that, real life is much more complicated than this.
Great, thanks.
One more question. I have a quick question. I think it's a variant of Roger's question.
But what would happen in situations where there were solutions that individual learners couldn't achieve? So where you have to do some social learning. So putting it together with the previous talk, where there's a culture that's sufficiently complex that you can't rediscover it in a single generation.
Yeah, and then that might be a way of penalizing individual learning in a way. I mean, this setup is a series of actions that are all occurring in one context where you can figure it out by paying a linear cost. But if the cost is too great to be learned in one lifetime, then you would necessarily rely on social learning.